Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to this Reboot dialogue on hacking the future, Solarpunk's vision for a sustainable world. My name is Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, a Democracy School podcast. In an era of multiple global crises, from the climate emergency to rising populism and the existential threats posed by rapid developments in AI, positive visions of a sustainable and regenerative future are urgently needed. This episode explores Solarpunk, an emergent movement gaining traction for its life-affirming outlook. We unpack its potential for revitalizing democracy and social movements, examine how Solarpunks propose balancing technological advancement with sustainability, and explore ways of democratizing big tech in an age of techno-feudalism to enable the emergence of new economic and social structures. Joining me is Pawel Ngei, a hacker and social punk researcher focusing on narratives of technology in culture, climate futurism in particular. He works with the Global Innovation Gathering, collaborating with inventors and educators from the Global South to discover new community-based perspectives on tech and culture. Pawel blogs at lxd.org and co-writes the Solarpunk Prompts podcast. I can see that Pawel has arrived, so do let me invite him in. Hey, Pawel. Good to see you.
Good to see you as well.
And we have a perfectly clear reception. Are you based in? I take it you're kind of coming on from Warsaw in Poland. Is that correct?
Yes.
I'm really glad to have you here. You've come with high recommendations. Pawel, you clearly seem to be one of the sort of the leading proponents of the solarpunk movement. So let's kind of dig straight in here. I'm really curious to learn more about what solarpunk is about. Now, people talk about it in terms of a genre or a movement. What exactly is it? What is it to you? And why do people call it punk? Why is it punk?
All good questions. So I think it's important to describe it as both a genre and a movement, because it's a genre of fiction which acknowledges that we are facing the climate crisis, and yet doesn't want to surrender, doesn't want to give in to despair or say that it's too late or nothing could be done, but instead imagines what we can do as people, as our civilization, to actually start adjusting, and how can we arrive at a sustainable civilization, which will be not only a state of survival, so not only some kind of post-apocalypse, but also which will be even better than our current civilization. A world which is more human centered, which is more just and sustainable, not only in ecological context, but also how do we relate to each other? How do we relate to infrastructure, technology around us? And we don't have a pope. We don't have anybody who will tell you, oh, this is solarpunk, this is not solarpunk. So we have a lot of different definitions. And some people will be more anarchist, as in building parallel infrastructures. Some people will be, oh, I'm just a writer trying to imagine what we could do. Some people may be practitioners, hackers, makers, creating technology. Others will be mostly activists and campaigners, because we share the same kind of sense of urgency and despair with a lot of activists that are currently just doing whatever they can imagine to get attention. But solarpunks see that it's not enough to get attention. You need to sustain people's attention and tell them that if you want to go to a better place, you need to imagine that better place. You need to imagine towards what we are going. And I think this is the definition of punk, where really it started almost accidentally, because somebody on the blog, The Republic of Bees, in 2008 proposed, hey, we have all those genres. We have steampunk, we have cyberpunk. Could we have a genre for like a better sustainable future called like solar punk? So the suffix started being used as just something genre, but then it transformed and people started actually thinking about it, connecting what they realized they were missing. So for example, we have a lot of philosophy and a lot of books coming into Solarpunk that already existed, like Murray's Bookchin's books, and the whole notion of municipalism, communalism. We have a lot of books from Ursula Le Guin with this very social science fiction and imagining how we can live in a world differently. And there's a lot of discussion, and different people will approach it differently. But for me, the punk version is okay, we tried rebelling to the system, and this rebellion kind of got old. Like, it's not enough to just rebel, just say we don't agree. It's time to start proposing something else, and this building something else is like a rebellion even towards a rebellion. So we don't want to just say we will be protesting for the sake of saying no. We say we are already building a better future, we are already building structures which are different, and we want you to imagine this with us and to join us, not in any single particular version of that, but in one of proposals, and just wanting to prototype them.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a whole host of, if you like, fractions or groupings within the kind of ecology or the wider kind of climate movement. And I suppose solar punks are forming one of those groupings within it. I can think of, for example, say, sort of eco socialists, so I can think of a whole host of or deep ecologists, or there's a whole bunch of different groups who, in a way, all are working on different ways of living, and of course also different ways of developing infrastructure in the world we live in. And of course, all of these attempts, all of these movements have one thing in common: it's all about a switch from a kind of toxic kind of way of being that we're currently pursuing, kind of like on our way into sort of a climate catastrophe, to switch away from that into a very, very different sort of modus operandi, a very, very fundamentally different way of being. And some people only kind of approach this on the surface. It's all about whatever kind of alternative heating and alternative this and double glazing and you name it. And others approaching it at a far deeper level, recognizing that we need to change our ways of doing business. We need to change the way we relate to each other. Indeed, we need to develop a new relationship to work. And there's other aspects, our kind of like fascination and total sort of like commitment to growth is another kind of aspect which people are within that broader kind of sphere are questioning. Now, solarpunks have taken all of this on board, have developed that further. But what sets solarpunks apart from all these other movements and groupings?
For me, that would be mostly the notion that writing fiction is activism. And again, not everybody will fully agree with that, because there are solarpunks who are just practitioners. But I think every solarpunk that I know appreciates a vision of the future which incorporates all the elements that they are fighting for. And this allows us to not only say, oh, in 50 years or in 100 years, so 3 world wars from now, we will have a nice place, but it allows us to also see how different we could perceive today. And this is how I came into the movement, because I started as this open source, open hardware person, as a hacker trying to work with technology, very surprised. Why aren't we sharing technology more openly? And just gathering stories from all over the world, especially from the global south, and realizing that there are so many stories and so many good technologies that we could be using that originated outside of the US or Europe, or that we could just start swapping between continents. But it's not only we do not want to, but we do not even acknowledge their existence. And I realized that unless we form a language where we could share stories about those technologies and stories of how differently we could be living, I don't think we could like accept any technology, any lifestyle change coming with it to
It's
Europe.
interesting. I mean, like, if I
Mhm.
understand this correctly, is you're placing narrative or like the ability to sort of to tell the story of a different future at the core of Solarpunk. Now, what interests me here is how continuous is this story? I mean, people very often kind of like have the Star Trek example of one future, yeah, the sort of the socialist version, possibly. I don't know, where there is no money and values are kind of, or status is defined differently and all the rest. So you get it, but the issue to me here is when with Solarpunk, are you talking about a story that starts today and that kind of we then kind of like end up in that future, or is this a story about a future that is utopian, that is kind of discontinuous? In other words, do you understand what I'm saying? We don't know how to get
Yes,
to Star Trek, but clearly
exactly.
it is a vision of the future that some people have.
Exactly. And again, different writers will approach it differently because for some, Solarpunk is like post apocalypse. Everything broke and we are rebuilding, or post apocalypse, where this rebuilding is actually working well. For some people, it will be purely utopian. We arrived at a utopia. We do not mention how, but let's describe how this utopia could look like. And those two have their own values. Have like you can learn a lot from both stories, and you can ask a lot of questions in those stories. And I think which would be the most important to you and the general democratic discourse. That's what I am seeing that is lacking is we are not prototyping futures in our mainstream culture. And Solarpunk is trying to bring a little bit of that, where different stories placed in different like historical periods, whether now, whether in 20, 50 years, whether in some better realized utopian world, we want to ask, okay, there will be this problem. We know that there will be such kind of problem. How do we want to solve it? Is this solution, is this societal price what we want? Because currently, if you see a debate in a parliament or even any kind of expert debate, they are either talking about extremely specific things, like you said, glazing windows in a very particular way, or something extremely broad and unspecific, and there's nothing in between. So Solarpunk wants to bring those prototypes, and again, every author comes with something else. For example, a lot of authors focus on how can we have democracy and how can we have sustainability in a post-privacy world, because Facebook, Google, and so on know so much about us that we would need to change how a lot of our processes work. And there are Solarpunk books, for example, imagining how we can function in a world where privacy doesn't work as it does. Some books are okay, we want to be maximally private and we want to work in small communities which operate between each other. But then there's a question, how do you work on infrastructure? How do you build proper intercontinental train track if you'd have only small communities? So there are a lot of proposals which can be implementable on different levels without one single masterpiece saying, this is how we go towards the glorious future.
There is, in a way, in my way of thinking, when you're talking narrative,
Mhm.
there is sort of two ways of approaching it. We can start it in the here and now and move forward. And this is very often the kind of a world where the pragmatists win, in a sense that it's very easy to kind of, like as I say, there's a million ways of killing a good idea. Oh, that's not possible. Oh, let's be pragmatic. We know all these arguments why, and we're dealing, well, basically, it's a sort of a 5% mindset. We can tweak it a bit this way, a bit this way, but there's a sort of a political kind of sphere within which we can move. But it's pragmatic, and it takes us hopefully in, and this is very much what mainstream politics is all about. We agree a 1.5 degree target, it's some kind of like some arbitrary target. And then we kind of begin to think, okay, how can we get there? And we move, oh, we have to take care of this. We have to deal with this. We have to discount for that. Oh, and so we're moving forward. That's one way. There's another way, and you said prototyping different futures. I think that's a really nice way of looking at it, because what that makes you then do is you're not moving forward, but you're moving back. You're sort of saying, well, if that's the kind of future we want, how can we trace a way back from that future to the present? And that's a very, very different. There's no pragmatism involved in this because, I mean, we're going backwards. Yeah, there's no backward pragmatism. And it's a very, very different kind of way of kind of arriving at the future. It's, people used to talk about reverse engineering. That was a thing back in the 1980s. And it's a kind of a reverse engineering of the future. And I think that's a very, very interesting kind of distinction to be made here, that you prototype the future and then you reverse engineer it back to the present. That's, to me, seems to be very much what you're saying. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, yeah, and reverse engineering is something that I do a lot as technologist, as an engineer, and this is essentially using similar principles with stories. But there's one notion, because I know that in the comments we will always have somebody saying, "But if you start at a utopia, connecting it to today, like it's not possible. It's just too unrealistic." And I think it's important to say that Solarpunk doesn't need to start at this future, which is fully perfect and utopian. And I work on a podcast for writers, which actually helps them process this. And we have stories of like small snapshots of the world that is a little better despite all the problems. And you can prototype things around. So one of the stories that's as a good example is, we know that there will be a lot of unemployment. The recent advent of AI has shown us much more painfully how just huge that would be than the original stories of, oh, the miners will need to do something because we will not have any more coal to mine. And how do we want to tackle that? So, for example, we have a story set in a community center somewhere 2050, 2060, where this is a place which decades ago, so apparently now, started a program respecializing people that lost not only their jobs, but their whole professions. Their profession is no more. They need to find a new way of living, a new way to support themselves. And in like, how can we imagine this better? So how can we imagine this? So we have this imagined as a fully communal place, which is not only governmentally mandated, but has a whole ecosystem of people. And this is as much trainings, but also emotional, spiritual support. Because if you have somebody who lost their identity and their livelihood, if you do not give them some emotional support and some space to essentially find themselves anew, uh, some populists will come and get them. And you see that with a lot of democracies. The moment you start hitting like huge groups with mass unemployment, whichever populist group starts getting a lot of power in that region. And in context of democracy, it's something you need. So given that story, which is not a perfect utopia, but it's a slice of the world that may happen. We know that we are going there economically. How can we support those people? And in the bigger context, how can this go forwards to the future?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'm thinking quite a bit about AI myself. In fact, I've got an interesting dialogue going with Joshua Bengio, one of the kind of the founding fathers of machine learning. But what interests me about AI, I mean, you're right. It will have a massive impact on the way we work, and in fact, it has that impact already. I mean, I use it, increasingly in my own work. I find it incredibly useful, and it's making me a lot more productive. I'm sure it does the same to other people. But of course, I work for myself. I don't have a boss who then says to me, "Well, in that case, you can do twice as much, can't you?" So, because I mean, what we will see is that AI isn't going to free people up. It's going to speed things up. So we're going to be forced to process more because of the kind of efficiency gains that brings. Now, you're absolutely right. That'll lead to a certain number of layoffs. People will lose their jobs. Now, but what it also will force, in my view, is a kind of a sort of that we begin to think differently about what work is. When you sort of say AI leads to unemployment, now I don't think that's the case. I mean, I'm not employed, but I do not consider myself unemployed. Other people who live my life without an employer, they may well consider themselves unemployed. It depends on how you live, how you work, and so on and so forth. And I think, this notion of work as we have today, the 9 to 5 job, is very much a child of the Industrial Revolution. Before then, people had jobs. they had to fix a fence, they had to, milk the cows, these were individual jobs that they had to do throughout the day. They didn't have a 9-to-5 job. And so losing that 9-to-5 job is one thing, but becoming unemployed is a different thing. So I think what it will do, and I think, solar punks can really massively contribute to that, is we can begin to think differently about work. So we don't have to be unemployed. We just do different things. We might care for the elders, so we might become artists, so we might do all sorts of things. And in fact, we might be even busier than we've ever been, but maybe also more fulfilled. So yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, like, AI will have that impact, and we have to begin to think about this, because yes, absolutely, when people aren't used to essentially kind of curating their own time, they may well kind of look for guidance in far-right movements or what have you. So yeah, that's very, very true. But when the other aspect of solarpunk, which I'm curious about, is that link to technology, because of course that is very central to you. We can all have visions of the future where we become sheep farmers, or we back to the land, and there are indeed sort of deep ecologists who propagate this kind of future, that see technology as evil or as a huge problem, and going off grid, going offline as a kind of an aspiration. You're not one of these people. You're a technologist by trade, and so for you, technology is very much part of that future. So maybe talk a little bit about specifically about, we'll talk about it later in relation to, sustainability and growth and all this, and kind of its economic function. But I mean, purely really interested to hear more about the kind of aesthetics of technology, and the sort of, how it kind of becomes part of our lives in your future.
Mm-hmm. So I think we are using the word technology in two very different meanings, because the way you talked about AI, for me, you were talking about a tool. And for me, putting so much trust in a tool, for me as an engineer, is a little absurd. And how I see the world, putting so much into extremely imperfect and for me extremely overhyped tool that I see nearing the limits of what it can do, I am very careful, because we will start seeing those limitations very soon. And one example is AI, like neural networks, large language models, cannot write Solarpunk because they haven't eaten any Solarpunk. There was no Solarpunk in their training sets, and they are incapable of any kind of novel thoughts. So any kind of like, if you prompt any kind of neural network to give you a solarpunk story, or to give you a story which would create a vision of a different future, you will get progressively more and more garbled, I don't even know how to call it, some confused mess that doesn't make sense, because it just cannot do that. And in solarpunk that I propose, technology is not a set of tools that we praise, but technology is essentially, first, an appropriate technology. So always adjusted to the needs, both energy needs and what a given community needs. But I like calling it technology is crystallized community. So when community comes and decides we need to make decisions this way, they start creating like a small technological garden with tools that they've chosen, and they add on it together with their traditions, with their like laws, regulations, and they end up with some infrastructure that serves them and how they want to live. So this is the aspect you mentioned, that we could think not of 9-to-5 jobs, but we could shape the future. But at the same time, we would need to start seeing technology as infrastructure and technology as serving us, as tools that we very intentionally use. And this is one of the biggest problems with the narratives outside of Solarpunk that I see, because technology is invisible, as in, we do not see all the decisions that went into designing technologies. We do not ask ourselves a lot of questions, like with the AIs, with all of the LLMs. we don't ask ourselves, why is it not okay for the web archive to start scanning books and make them public for people, but it's okay for all the companies making the large language models to start scanning everybody's books without compensating them, everybody's art without compensating them? And this is hidden from us, and this is huge decision that, like, as democracy we should, like, as a society, make together. But we haven't, because it's invisible, it's hidden from us. And in Solarpunk that I see, the technology is very intentional. Like, I wanted to do something and I chose the tool for it. Not something happened outside of my knowledge or my community's knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And of course, the way we have developed technologies in the developed world is very much about, it's all about logging, isn't it? It's about creating sort of like network externalities and about logging, basically forcing people. I mean, the time will come when you will really depend on ChatGPT or an equivalent sort of like model, you know, like in your work, whether you freelance or work in an organization. And if you don't have that access, you will be at a distinct disadvantage in the same way as today already. You know, if you're kind of a certain age, like my mother, for example, and you're not so technology literate, then you may find it increasingly difficult even to pay your bills or to, you know, to kind of conduct bank transactions, because everything is online. Everything requires like a basic understanding of computers and how to work them, and indeed mobile phones. And if you don't have that access, if you don't have technology, you have a problem. And of course, that is very much the kind of the way things have developed here. And of course, I mean, when people buy a computer or a phone, they don't really ask themselves, what do I need? I've never heard anybody. They ask, what's the fastest? What's the biggest? And that's what they buy. That's what they want, and it's sold to us on that basis. It's even faster. It's even bigger. You know, and it's interesting. I was talking to someone some time ago. Works for a hardware manufacturer. They make mobile phones in Singapore, and the phones they make are basically what we had, like the old Nokia that we had in the 1990s. Yeah, not smartphones, normal phones. They have a battery life by now of nearly 2 weeks. Now, this is a sort of a thing you really want to have in places where you can't charge your phone every day or every second day. Of course, in Western Europe or in North America, you want to have the fastest phone and you don't mind charging it once a day or every second day. But if you live in the Congo or in like remote area of Kenya, then really it's a huge advantage if you only have to charge it once every 2 weeks. And so clearly there'll be increasing differences in technology, but we are still very much, as you said, caught up in this mindset that we don't really think about it, you know, like what we really need, but it's just what we should have.
Exactly. And this is something that we are being sold onto. Like, we are not consciously, like, I don't even see a space for us to question it in our general discourse. If you look at technology in our like general culture, if you watch any kind of action movie, superhero movie, you have this notion, technology is always a weapon. And if you watch all those Iron Man or Black Panther movies, like, if somebody has technology that could give free electricity to whole continents, nope, it's a weapon. We need to control it as a weapon. If you look at cyberpunk movies, all of the future dystopias, you see that technology will be always used as either a means of rebellion against the evil state or the means of control of the people. There's so much technology independent for this. And for me, the most solarpunk technology right now, it's not a solar panel, which is a little absurd, but Wikipedia. Because if you think about it, Wikipedia is not like an engineering technology. The platform is important, but it's not the thing in Wikipedia. It's the social structure. Because if you go back 50 years and talk to any of the huge science fiction writers of that time, you tell them, oh, there will be that kind of encyclopedia that everybody has access to in essentially all of the languages for free, written and double checked by everyone, and it will be just a thing. They will tell you it's so unrealistic and so naive that it cannot happen. And we have it, but our culture doesn't have stories about Wikipedia. And Solarpunk can tell stories about Wikipedia. And we have authors who actually write stories describing like similar developments based on Wikipedia. But just going back to what is happening in Kenya and what is happening in the global south versus the global north, our approach to technology wastes so much energy and so much materials by needing the new thing just for the capitalist gains. Uh, it's absurd to me, and we have so much. Oh, fintech! We will have this or that platform for instant money payments. More than a decade ago, Kenya had M-Pesa, which had like all of the digital money without any needs for energy-hungry blockchain, and it worked on like GSM 3 or I think even GSM 2 in some places, which like you could have essentially you would define it as a smartphone because it has functions of all your PayPal's, Wises, and everything else, but it would be a regular old Nokia and it wouldn't need any fancy software. And like every person in Kenya, like every vendor with a banana stall has M-Pesa. And it's not perfect because it's not open source and I would still argue about a lot of things, but why aren't we using something like this? Why do we need something that eats 100 times more energy? Because this is the degrowth that Solarpunk would be talking about, that we are using way too much power and resources that we don't need to waste on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, of course, there's a number of examples I can think of. Like Mastodon would be another example of, I think, a very successful social media platform, which is obviously, you know it probably much better than I use it, but I'm not a technologist in that way. But of course, it not only was it very is it successful, and I find it really very usable, and I it's actually one of my favorite platforms, probably. Probably the most favorite platform at the moment for me. But then of course it's so popular that that Meta, like Facebook, had to bring out Threads, which is basically based on the same technology but proprietary. And you can see how this appropriation happens. And of course, Meta or Facebook, they could leverage the Instagram and their Facebook users onto Threads and instantly, more or less overnight, be 10 times the size of Mastodon. And of course, that is what we are up against, aren't we? And so the question is, this leads me on to my next question: how can Solarpunk become a sort of a global movement? How can we break out of the closet? What kind of strategies are there to make this into a popular movement?
So I see two questions here because I see both a question how to become one and the question how not to get appropriated.
Okay, it's both questions are both very important.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, because how to become a global movement? I believe that if we start creating stories and like if every writer who just muses about the future starts creating their own prototype and we discuss those prototypes, those that like we don't need anthologies that will be winning awards in every country. We have a few good books, but what we need is for like our culture to accept that we can prototype those visions of the future. And we can see that if we feel the climate despair, we do not need to do something that will just get people's attention, just throw paint on something. But we can start coordinating in a movement which will not only protest, but will start building something in parallel. Like we have a lot of examples of really great parallel infrastructures, like the Freifunk in Berlin is something that I think is like respectable when it comes to if all of the internet in Berlin fails, they still have their anarchist run free software version of the internet. They still can communicate. And we can work the same way. We already had cases where those parallel infrastructures saved lives. In Nepal, during the earthquake, it turned out that OpenStreetMap, this Google alternative, had more data than their own government, and they were able to save lives. In Japan, after Fukushima, the same thing with the radiation mapping, where it's the activists on the ground who did it. But those stories are not shared as widely as I would like to. So for me, for Solarpunk to become a global movement, we just need to start sharing stories because we have so much happening. And it's not only in the West, there is so much happening in the global South. and stories which are mind-blowing for me, because something that I would expect from a Hollywood blockbuster, the story of Sierra Leone, that I can link because it's a longer story, but it's something that got me into, I need to find a way to describe it, because when everything failed and the whole region was about to collapse, they were able to restart the local infrastructure, just community run with the people on the ground. And this is the epitome of Solarpunk for me.
I remember that. I remember that. I mean, these examples, and I think they're extremely valuable, and I think they're very much at the core of your vision. But they are all centered around communication technologies, ultimately. And that's this, of course, or information technology, and of course that is a big chunk. But Solarpunk goes beyond information technology,
Mhm.
and the web, and so on and so forth, and transactional technologies. It's a much wider idea, and so how do you? I mean, this is a thing. It's like because it's so closely intertwined with economic development. And because we have such entrenched interests when it comes to economic development, capitalist interests, when it comes to economic development, that it's, as you said, it's very, very difficult not to become appropriated by it. Because the moment something is successful, like Mastodon, you have a Meta who can basically kind of copy the aspects it needs to copy, and leverage its financial and networking muscle, to basically take a big chunk over. So this is a huge problem in so many different areas. And going on to AI, I mean, of course, there are open source models there as well. Not all AI is kind of controlled by the big four. So there's other like models, but of course, then there's governance issues, in terms of like, and there's other kind of risks associated with open source and AI. But what do you suggest in terms of organization? Do you think this needs to somehow be formally organized, or that needs to? I mean, Wikipedia is an example of a very formal structure, yeah. And Mastodon is an example of of instances of much looser hubs. Um, how do you see that kind of future, of that technology infused kind of different, yeah, world?
Mhm. So this is a really interesting question, because it goes both on the level of today and how can we organize when we arrive at the point that we want to call a better world. And for me, what you mentioned before, this information networks, those communications are the base for it, because knowing how to relate to each other, not only in the corporate networks, which, like, I don't mind Facebook owning the network as much as I mind Facebook shaping how we communicate to each other. And I've seen a lot of movements die because Facebook allows only like this many admins, and there is no way to vote on something. One admin can dissolve a group. And when you ask me about Mastodon, and I'm one of the code contributors to Mastodon, so hey, I did something, and I welcome everybody to also contribute to things. I don't think that Facebook is a threat here, because we know how it will happen, how threads will start first integrating. They will change some things and try to force Mastodon to change things to match it. But the independence of the movement is the heart, because the corporations, like, if I could only think about any recent example of any big social network being bought by one demagogue and used for his own purposes, that would be nice. But as you see, it would be near to next to impossible for Mastodon to be just bought, because, like, think about those networks like Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon. Those are all our town squares. This is the place people communicate with each other. And the same way we wouldn't allow anybody to buy such a square and create new rules, we shouldn't allow this to become private. And there are different solutions. Some people may say we should have governmental funds which say that social media are infrastructure, and we should be essentially paying taxes for like local Mastodon or similar servers.
The way we
It's
do for streets and for
yeah,
roads and for other kind of public infrastructure.
exactly, and we would have problems that go with streets and public infrastructure, where the mayor is busy with something else. This street has had a pothole for the last 5 months. We could say that we should normalize paying for it, and like €5 a month for access to all of the social media should be normalized as a thing. This will have another kind of disadvantage. And again, we have proposals. I do not have one foolproof solution, but what I can say is we should look at the proposals, we should analyze them and discuss them, and we shouldn't be afraid that one company will come and do something better. Because yes, threads or whichever next thing will be more convenient. They will create something with better usability, but I am not afraid of them taking over all of the connections we have between each other. And the same way with just to tell you about the narratives, like the best the example of Solarpunk visuals is a yogurt ad. So if anybody asks me, aren't you afraid that the narratives and visuals will be appropriated? Well, it's too late to be afraid. It happened. And what we can do is just promote the notions of community, of discussing things, of visible, questionable, like not questionable, technology that you could question, that you could discuss. Uh, if you put them with those aesthetics or any other aesthetics into the public discourse, I believe this is a win for Solarpunk.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what I find interesting is I can, well, globally, I think our current sort of business model for like sort of like online social media and communications is breaking down. The kind of algorithms that, in a way, analyze and manage platforms like Facebook and also networks like Google, I find it increasingly difficult to handle the increasing volume of fake and false information that is being generated through AI. And it is there's a lot of people who sort of say we're kind of approaching breaking point of that. When these algorithms simply break within the next 2 to 3 years, after which this kind of model where like kind of I find Google already very difficult, very unsatisfactory to use as a search engine. But this is going to get worse and worse and worse. So I think this is a front attack. And what's interesting about that is it's the very companies that are under attack here that are also essentially owning and developing the AI. Google, Gemini, Microsoft, ChatGPT, and so on and so forth. Siri with Apple and so on. So you can see how they are eating themselves up, and how AI is kind of turning in on itself. Now, so this is one thing. The kind of ad-driven business model that we have been pursuing and so successfully, and which has made the Googles of this world so rich, is breaking. And so that's one thing. And they know this, and they are thinking about new models. And I think Solarpunk has got a great opportunity here, an opening. The other thing, and this is more about Europe than kind of globally, the European Commission, of course, is getting increasingly worried about the interference of social media on our political and democratic processes. And is handing out massive fines for the Facebooks and the Googles of this world if they don't meet their obligations, their governance obligations. And this is only going to get worse again with AI, and this is going to be a tidal wave. And I really doubt whether they will be able to fulfill their obligations under these new regulatory frameworks, which ultimately means we're going to shut them down. So these are two, both on a commercial side and on the political side, they are under attack. And so there's a massive window opening up, I think, for alternative ways of thinking about this. And I think the powers to be, like the European Commission and governments in Europe and other places, are open to ideas of how we can do things differently. And I think this is an opportunity for Solarpunk to move out of the fringes into the limelight.
Mm-hmm. And there are several things you said. So let's start with just the capitalist aspect. I am one of the people who does not believe that capitalism, however reformed, will be able to survive the next few decades, Because let's just quickly do definitions. I'm not talking about the notion of markets and trade. I am talking about what we are seeing with stock market, companies being able to widely speculate what has what value, and what you just described with the AI growth already destroying the base products of the companies. There was this beautiful quote that growth for the sake of growth is a philosophy of a cancer cell. No better illustration for me. We would need to think about some other kind of economy, and Solarpunk books already propose some. There are some proponents who are saying we should have an economy based not on gold or just imaginary unit of money, but on carbon. The more carbon something generates, the more expensive it will be, with socialist regulations so that we can fulfill basic needs. But if you want to take an intercontinental flight, oh, this will be expensive. So there are different proposals, and again, no single one is perfect. But I do believe that what we are seeing with those huge corporations, especially with them speculating and using a lot of the global south countries for cheap labor, because like most of those ais, most of the neural networks are being trained in Kenya, India, and if I'm not wrong, Malaysia, where people are being paid $1 to $4 an hour to train them. And this also brings an extremely interesting problem, because we now see that mistakes made by people from those cultures actually appear in neural networks. And we have models where if you type in empty string, you will see an Indian woman in traditional sari, because somebody mislabeled something as an empty string. And we will see that, like, we will see a lot of interesting influences like this. But the economy will need to change. I do not know what will be the collapse of which sector first. I do not think we can stop all of the collapses of different sectors, but if we create enough fallbacks, both societally and by governments, if we have enough resilient infrastructure, we will be able to go past that. And now, when it comes to the commission, I've been one of the people campaigning for free open source software for years, for over a decade. And one of the people who has been teaching how fake news works and how to defend from it for years. I've worked with multiple activists going to the European Commission about that. And the problem is that the Commission has very few people that understand how things work. What are the technological consequences on the societal side? And the European Commission, however well intentioned, is listening to a lot of lobbyists, and activists do not make good lobbyists. They just don't have enough money to just very gently and smoothly invite someone over for dinner. So I do expect that the Commission will come up with a lot of regulations which will be a big step from their perspective, but will not be a huge game changer from a Solarpunk standpoint, because uh, we have been seeing that social media are like used to influence people in elections for more than a decade. With Brexit, with with multiple countries, including in Europe, in Czechia, we had the example of micro targeting, and we would need to completely rethink how we do it. I do not believe that a single top-down regulation will work, especially that if you look at a lot of regulations proposed by the Commission in the last, say, 8 years, they forget about the communities a lot. We have regulations which is supposed to impact companies, but somehow Google, Facebook have enough money to always weasel out. Because, for example, they don't post the blurbs from the newspapers, but they have the neural networks and they paraphrase them. So it's no longer taxable, and they don't need to pay those taxes. But if you are a small company, you have a problem. Worse, if you are a blogger and if you don't want to influence the whole society, but you just want to write a few articles, it may be that the regulation will hit you. So for me, the commission would need to start thinking about people who are the most grassroots and supporting those groups for any kind of social media or discourse reform to happen.
That's an interesting idea. I mean, how would you, well, can you elaborate on that?
That's like, I do not think I am a good legislator, but what I would imagine is we could fund a lot of research into platforms such as Mastodon. So essentially, we could learn about a lot of side effects of how platforms federate or how they distribute their information. We could start funding research into those platforms from technical universities. So, for example, if we have a technical problem in Mastodon, why wouldn't one or the other technical university come and help solve it in a way that would help all of the communities using Mastodon? And I'm not hung up that Mastodon is the best because we have so many options. We just need to open ourselves and stop defining that, oh, social media are only the big three. We could also look at really glorious examples. We have social media which were specifically written to achieve consensus. And I think for you and for anybody who is interested in democracy, looking at poll.is, police, the Greek police, which has been used in Taiwan and in a lot of other places to generate uh, some kind of consensus, not as manufacturing, forcing people, but what would be the version of this regulation that everybody would agree to? They essentially have a platform which allows to iterate on a proposal until everybody agrees. And for me, talking social networks, this is one of the most solarpunk examples ever. And we have a lot of good research. So, for example, adopting this the same way as it has been used in Taiwan with the V Taiwan, and seeing how we can work on it, because we had, the way I see, or maybe let's put it this way: when giving a similar lecture at University of Warsaw, I was asked, okay, so how can Solarpunk solve the problem with the Green New Deal and the farmers not wanting it? Great, I am such a policy expert, but what I am seeing is the farmers are not feeling that they have any kind of agency. The farmers feel that somebody, some bureaucrat decided something for them. They had no say. And currently, if they wanted to have a say, there are so many intermediaries, it would be extremely hard to get to anybody decisive. But if we create a platform which would allow smaller grassroots groups to communicate with the decision makers, I can totally imagine this being a much better solution. I'm not saying that Polis is the platform because this would require a lot of research. But if we want for the populists to have much less sway because, oh, those European bureaucrats are so evil, if we want laws that really satisfy people all over the continent, we could really look into those platforms that give people agency. And I think this is also something I didn't mention, but in all the sustainability, in all the solar panels, wind turbines, and proper building codes, Solarpunk is about giving people agency, because this is something that they do not feel they have now, either in capitalism or in democracy, because going to vote once every few years does not give you a real say in what law will be created for you, in how your future will be. And we need both proposals for the future and proposals that give people agency. If somebody is a miner in Poland right now and their family has been miners for the last 5 generations, they will not vote for anybody who says we need to shut off coal. But if they would vote for somebody who says we cannot do that in the future, but we want a future where your children can still be proud of their identity and your region can preserve your identity and your agency by becoming something else. And if we create like a specialization in the region that was previously coal based to be wind turbine based, I'm totally seeing it as something that could work. So by giving people agency, we can like really strengthen the democracy.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one aspect of that is, of course, is to figure out how we want to relate to each other, because, of
Yes.
course, it's in that mix where things either turn toxic, as we see on Twitter or on other kind of like commercial platforms, and then we see platforms like Mastodon have sort of like actually managed to solve some of that quite eloquently. I mean, for example, on Mastodon, you don't have a quoting possibility, because the quoting, where I basically kind of tweet on what you have said and I kind of paraphrase it, or I kind of take the mickey or do something, that is essentially the kind of the dynamite. That's the kind of the spark that will get some kind of hate going. If I can't quote you in that way, if I have to write an original tweet myself, then of course I'm a different ballgame. So Mastodon has thought about these things in quite a good way and has found solutions. So as a result of it, Mastodon, in my experience, is far more peaceful than Twitter, because it doesn't allow structurally for the same kind of hate-driven communications. Now, the reason why Twitter and others allow for that, of course, is because it's good for commerce. So because that attracts, like emotion attracts people, and then it brings, so you can see how it's clickbait, so you can see how that works in that world, and you can also see why Mastodon has approached this differently. And I think this goes back to what you sort of say about Solarpunk, is that in a way we need to start with that story, we need to start with that vision of how we want to live in that future, and then we can start to think about the elements that are kind of part of that future. And it gets me back to the kind of reverse engineering. We can then say, well, okay, how do we build that into our infrastructures to give us a chance to get there? Is that a fair comment?
Absolutely. And the books are the Solarpunk books I recommend all focus on this notion, and they all have the notion of how our communication technology impacts our communities, how our language changes. And like I love that, for example, in the Half Built Garden by Rutanna Emrys, like a whole plot is essentially about admins being angry because somebody messed up with the default options on their Mastodon server, and now they know that the political discourse within the whole community is hijacked because they need to have appropriate options to give enough space both for people who are specialists, for people who want to know more, and so on and so forth. But this is not something that is visible in our popular discourse, in the popular culture, because we do not discuss how Twitter works. The example you use with the quote tweet, if I am correct, this was actually done unintentionally at the beginning by an engineer who, oh, I could do that with a few lines of code, and then it happened, and it boosts engagement so much. So if I could say that Solarpunk is against something, it wouldn't be only anti-capitalist, but it's also anti-techno-solutionism. Because let's be mindful, how do we solve our problems? Let's learn from each other, because we have so many things where just how we see the world limits us. I love this example where you have a lot of NGOs working to help in Kenya give people money, because apparently, according to the research, an average Kenyan has extremely low accessibility for loans, and we have a lot of microloans. But nobody is counting that Kenya has a lot of informal social groups called chamas, uh, which are essentially like neighbor lending clubs where neighbors lend money to each other and they don't need to go to the bank. We just don't see that there is such a thing, and instead of creating a platform which would help strengthen this, and without manipulating them, just strengthen the bonds they have already within their communities, we are trying to give them something next which is foreign to their culture. So this discussion, this observing how different cultures function and how we can support them, I believe that this would be the most solarpunk way forward.
Excellent. I think this has been a really, really, really interesting chat, and I hope that we have only been able to really cover very, very little of this topic, and we have been kind of zigzagging it as well, which I think is good to get a first impression of what Solarpunk is about. Before we finish, you mentioned a couple of books already, but is there anything that you would like to recommend to our viewers and listeners to give them a sort of a head start on to a way into the solar punk idea?
So, if you want something really short, I would recommend the podcast that I'm the co-writer of. It's called Solarpunk Prompts, and those are not the AI prompts. Those are like, imagine a small solarpunk story and try imagining your way through it or towards it. So they are 10 to 15 minutes long, and I think they could really help with the imagination of what solarpunk is. If you would like anthologies, there are great anthologies with multiple stories. There are Solarpunk Winters and Summers. There are the multi-species cities. But the books that I would recommend the most would be what I said, Ruthanna Emre's A Half-Built Garden. Uh, this is not a huge masterpiece, but this is a book which touches so many things I've just explained that I think is a great example. Alex Beckett's Game Changer, which describes a world with this carbon based currency, which for me is a really interesting one, especially with the social media layer on top and how it goes into their economy. And several books by Cory Doctorow, both Walk Away, which is more anarchist, and the recent The Lost Cause, which is much closer and in very America in a few years world. I think that they are all of those books are bold enough that they can pull us forward. And if anybody wants and some philosophy underlying Solarpunk, Murray's Bookchin's books about municipalism and communalism would be the best read.
Brilliant. And now, for those who are like, accomplished technologists, and understand the basics of solar punk already, but are really keen to network more and to kind of get involved in stuff at a sort of a more advanced level. Any recommendations for those people?
There are so many different groups depending on what you want. I would really recommend if you want to get into the practicals. There's Appropedia, the appropriate technology wiki, which is like you can see so many technologies and help people building and sharing stuff from all over the world. If you want to discuss things with writers, hashtag Solarpunk on Mastodon. If you follow like either you or me, you essentially will have a lot of people already in the discussions. There are several groups around the Solarpunk magazine. There are several, like, there are so many groups. I need to write a blog post summarizing all those.
Absolutely. Please do that. And I will also encourage our listeners and viewers to get in touch with you if they have questions or if they want to contribute or get involved in any way, both in the global north, but also in the global south. There's one or two people in Africa that I may like to introduce to you at some point, sort of like later, well, just outside of this podcast, who work in technology, and you might find them interesting potential future partners or people to network with anyway. So this has been really, really interesting, Pawel. Thank you very, very much. Great kind of encounter. I hope we can have another dialogue maybe in a year's time or so and see where we get to, and take it from there.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Have a good one. Yeah, thank you. Bye bye.